In the spring of 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, a man named Ezra Whitfield Coles made a journey from southern Indiana to a location he described in his private correspondence only as the terminus, a word he used as if his correspondent already knew what it meant, and as if naming the place directly was not something he was willing to do even in a letter to his oldest friend. Coles had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 11 years before the war, had guided more than 60 people north through a network of safe houses and forest paths that he had memorized the way a river pilot memorizes a channel, and had continued operating that network through the first year of the war under conditions that became rapidly more dangerous as the federal government's commitment to returning escaped slaves to their owners remained unresolved into the early months of the Lincoln administration. He had stopped operating in 1862. Not because the network failed, but because the network was no longer needed in the way it had been. The Emancipation Proclamation had changed the calculus. The contraband camps were absorbing the movement of freedom, seeking people that the railroad had managed for decades. And the men and women who had made up the network's infrastructure were beginning the long process of transition to above-ground life. When Coles made his 1867 journey, the war had been over for 2 years. He was 53 years old. He was not carrying anyone. He was going back. I came to this through a collection of letters. The letters are in the possession of a great-great-grandniece of Coles's oldest friend, a Quaker farmer named Thomas Hadley, who lived in Wayne County, Indiana, and who kept Coles's correspondence for the whole of his adult life. Hadley died in 1891. The letters passed with his papers to his daughter, and through successive generations to their current holder, a retired librarian in Richmond, Indiana, named Constance Hadley Marsh, who contacted me in 2018 after reading an article I had published on the documentary record of the Indiana Underground Railroad Network. She had read her ancestors' papers in the 1980s and had understood, broadly, what they contained. She had not known what to do with the specific letter from the spring of 1867 because it described something she could not locate in any history of the Underground Railroad she had read, and she had been waiting for someone who might know where to place it. I drove to Richmond. She made me coffee. We sat at her kitchen table and she handed me a folder. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the terminus Ezra Whitfield Coles traveled to in the spring of 1867 was not a town in Canada, not a safe house that had outlasted the network's operational period, and not a symbolic destination of the kind that people sometimes revisit after a chapter of their lives has closed. It was a physical location in the northern United States that had functioned, in the final years of the Underground Railroad's operation, as something beyond a way station, a destination in its own right, a community whose existence the official record of the railroad's history has not documented, and whose nature Coles describes in his letter to Hadley in terms that took me a long time to fully read because of what they implied about what the people who built that community had created and how they had chosen to live in it. The letter withholds the terminus's location. It does not withhold what Coles found when he got there. And what he found had been there long enough, when he arrived in 1867, that the people who had built it were already raising the second generation. Consider what the Underground Railroad's northern terminus network actually looked like in its operational period. Because most people who know the railroad at all picture a linear path, south to north, slavery to freedom, the Ohio River to Canada, and the actual network in the Indiana-Ohio corridor was considerably more complex than that picture suggests. The network did not end at the Canadian border for everyone who traveled it. Canada was the formal legal terminus, the point beyond which American fugitive slave law did not reach. But Canada was also cold, often isolated, economically difficult for people arriving without resources or established community, and in many cases linguistically and culturally distant from the communities of the American South, where the travelers had spent their lives. The conductors who managed the Indiana network understood this, and some of them had developed, over the course of the 1850s, an alternative to Canadian resettlement that appears in the historical record only in private correspondence, never in the published accounts that railroad participants gave after the war. The alternative was not publicized because publicizing it would have defeated its purpose, which was to make a community of people invisible to the mechanisms, legal, social, commercial, that might seek to recover or relocate them. Before I describe what those letters say, I want to describe one other thing that is in the Hadley collection alongside the letters, because it establishes the alternative network's existence in documentary terms that go beyond personal correspondence. Among the Hadley papers is a land transaction record, a copy of a deed, handwritten, for a parcel of land in a northern location identified by a legal description that uses the section township range notation of the General Land Office survey system. The deed is dated 1852. The grantor is a Quaker land trust organized in Ohio. The grantee is described in the deed not by a personal name, but by the phrase for the use and benefit of the community then settled, or hereafter to be settled, on the within described premises. The deed conveys the land in fee simple to the community itself, not to any named individual who might die, remarry, or be legally compelled to produce a record of the transfer, and it was recorded in the relevant county's deed registry under a notation that makes tracing the subsequent history of that parcel through the standard land registry system extremely difficult, because the grantee name is a phrase rather than a person, and phrase named grantees were, in the land registry practices of the 1850s, handled inconsistently across different county systems. The deed copy in the Hadley papers is missing the county name at the top. The page is damaged at that corner. What the deed establishes is that the network supporting the North Clearing was sophisticated enough, in 1852, to be executing community land trusts of a legal complexity that most Americans of that period would not have known how to construct. Someone with legal training helped design this. Someone with institutional knowledge of Quaker land management helped execute it. The result was a parcel of land held in perpetual community title for people who were, in 1852, legally classified as property in the states they had come from. Coles describes this alternative in two earlier letters to Hadley, from 1858 and 1861, that are in the same collection. He does not name the location in those letters either. What he describes is a community of people who had chosen, or been guided, to stop before Canada. To stop in a location in the northern United States that was remote enough, and whose title to the land was arranged in a way complex enough that the ordinary mechanisms of fugitive slave recovery could not easily operate there. The guidance was not random. Coles's 1858 letter describes the decision of which travelers were offered the North Clearing as one made by the conductors in consultation with the travelers themselves. The travelers offered the alternative were not chosen by any single characteristic. They were, he writes, people who had said, in the course of the journey north, that they did not want to be found again. A phrase he italicizes, as if it is one he has heard more than once, and that carries a specific weight when the people who say it mean it. Not people who were afraid of being caught, though fear was present for all of them. People who had already decided, somewhere on the journey, that the destination they were going to was not a place but a condition, a permanent removal from the systems that had claimed them. Those travelers were told about the North Clearing. Those travelers were given the choice. He describes, in the same letter, helping a family of 5 reach a place he calls simply the North Clearing, a phrase that appears in several other Indiana conductor accounts I have found, always without elaboration, always with the same quality of referring to something the correspondent already knows. The North Clearing, the terminus. the place Coles went back to in 1867. This is the part I keep returning to. Because the phrase North Clearing appears in 6 other pieces of Indiana Underground Railroad correspondence from the 1850s, in 4 different collections, written by 4 different conductors who operated in different parts of the Indiana network. Not the same letter, not the same correspondent. 4 different people, over the course of roughly a decade, referring to a location by the same 2-word phrase without explaining it. The phrase is consistent enough across the collections that I do not believe it is coincidental, and specific enough, North Clearing, rather than a town name, a state name, a county name, that I do not believe it refers to Canada or to any established settlement. It refers to something that was deliberately kept out of the names that records use, because the people who knew about it understood that names in records were how places got found. The 1867 letter is the most detailed document about the terminus in any collection I have examined, because it was written after the legal need for concealment had passed, and because Coles was writing to his oldest friend, which gave him a latitude he had not permitted himself in the earlier letters. He describes the journey as taking 4 days from southern Indiana, traveling north and then northwest, passing through terrain he describes as increasingly wooded and then increasingly open, arriving at a location near a body of water he does not name. He describes the community he found as comprising somewhere between 40 and 60 people, organized into households, with fields under cultivation and structures of sufficient permanence to suggest they had been in place for at least a decade. He describes the community's governance. There was a council, he writes, of people who had been there longest, and decisions were made in a manner he found familiar from his Quaker meeting practice, by consensus and without formal hierarchy. He describes children who had been born there, who had no memory of slavery and no experience of the world south of wherever the North Clearing was. He describes the community's relationship to the surrounding landscape as one of thorough knowledge and deliberate invisibility. They knew the land well enough to move through it without leaving traces that an outsider would recognize as human passage. And they had arranged their settlement so that its visible features from any approach were consistent with abandoned farmland rather than active habitation. And then he describes why he went back. He had gone back to bring news of the 14th Amendment, the citizenship guarantee that had been ratified the previous year, and that in principle made the legal basis for the community's invisibility obsolete. They were citizens now. They could be visible. He went to tell them that the thing they had been hiding from had changed, and what he found when he delivered this news was not relief. It was a conversation that he describes in the letter as the most clarifying of his life, conducted over 2 evenings with several members of the council, in which the community's oldest members explained to him why they had no intention of becoming visible, and why the 14th Amendment, while a genuine change in the law, did not change the thing they had actually been hiding from. He does not reproduce that conversation in full in the letter. He says he lacks the words for the full account. What he does reproduce is a single statement from the oldest member of the council, a woman he refers to only as the elder, giving no name, who told him that the law had changed, but the country had not changed, and that the community had spent 20 years building something that the country would spend the next 100 years trying to prove was impossible, and that the best protection for impossible things was to remain invisible while the country spent its time on that proof. He writes that he did not argue with her. He writes that he has not been able to argue with her since. He made his way back to Indiana, and he wrote to Hadley, and the letter has been in that family's papers ever since. The location of the North Clearing is not in the letter, and I am not going to speculate about it here beyond what the letter's directional and terrain references suggest, which I have concluded is not sufficient to identify the location with any reliability. What I can tell you is that the phrase North Clearing appears in the historical record at intervals after 1867, that suggest the community persisted beyond Coles's visit. There is a reference to it in a letter from a black abolitionist organizer in Ohio, dated 1874, that describes the North Clearing as still operating and still receiving occasional newcomers through a network that had survived the railroad's formal dissolution. There is a second reference in a letter from a Quaker meeting in northern Indiana, dated 1881, describing a request for material support. Seed, tools, fabric, from a community in the northern region whose members preferred not to be named in correspondence. The request is described as coming through a channel that the meeting members understood had been operating since before the war. And there is a third reference in a County Historical Society record from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, dated 1906. Describing a small community of African American families in a remote inland area whose members told a county surveyor, when he encountered them in the course of mapping work, that they had been on the land for more than 50 years and had no interest in being mapped. No interest in being mapped. 50 years before 1906 would put their arrival in the territory somewhere around 1856. Which is consistent with the period when the North Clearing references begin appearing in the Indiana Conductor correspondence. I have not found any further record of this community after 1906. That absence could mean many things. It could mean the community dispersed into the surrounding regional population over the following decades, as the children of the second and third generations moved toward towns and cities and opportunities that the North Clearing, by its nature, could not provide. It could mean the community continued to exist and continued its practice of deliberate invisibility so successfully that it left no further trace. It could mean the 1906 county survey interaction was itself a turning point. That being mapped, even in a refusal to be mapped, created enough visibility that the community made choices about its future based on that interaction. I do not know which of these is true. I do not know if any of them is true. What I know is that the last clear evidence of the North Clearing's existence is a county surveyor's note from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1906, describing people who told him they had been on that land since before the Civil War and preferred to remain outside the record. The Underground Railroad is understood, in the standard history, as a network that existed to move people toward freedom and that dissolved when legal freedom arrived. That understanding is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a specific way that the North Clearing documents make visible. The railroad, in at least one part of its northern network, was also building something, not just moving people toward something that existed elsewhere. The conductors who guided people to the North Clearing were not delivering them to freedom, as it was defined by the law. They were delivering them to something the law had not built and could not build. A community whose freedom was not contingent on the law's protection because it was not visible to the law at all. The elder who spoke to Coles in 1867 understood this distinction precisely. The law had changed. The country had not changed. The best protection for impossible things was to remain invisible while the country argued about whether they were possible. What was lost, if anything was lost, is not recoverable in the way that a document in an archive is recoverable. The North Clearing's location was never in a record. Its people were never in a census. Its decisions were never in minutes. What Coles found there in 1867 was a community that had built its life on the principle that the most important things were the ones that no record could find. If they are gone, they left nothing to find. If they are not gone, if some version of what they built is still in the northern woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, maintained by descendants who have honored the elders' counsel for 150 years, then they have succeeded so completely at the thing they set out to do that there is no way to know. There is only Coles's letter, in a folder in Richmond, Indiana, and the phrase North Clearing in 6 pieces of correspondence from people who knew where it was and had decided not to write it down. If you know someone who has spent time with the history of the Underground Railroad and felt, at its edges, the sense of a larger story, a story about not just where people were going, but what they were building when they got there, share this with them. Ezra Whitfield Coles made a 4-day journey in the spring of 1867 to tell a community that freedom was now legal. The elder of that community told him that what they had built did not depend on legality and did not intend to become visible to it. He went home and wrote it down, and for 150 years, the letter has been the only record of a conversation that may be the most honest accounting anyone has left of what the railroad was actually for.